All right. Welcome, everyone, to the interdisciplinary speaker series on the ethics of argumentation. Thank you so much for coming in. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Oxana Pimenova. She has doctorates in law and public policy, and her research focuses on the distorted reasoning context of indigenous consultation and the unilateral reasoning practices that the government uses in these consultations. And today she's going to talk to us about conceptualizing and modeling rhetorical injustice. Take it away, Oxana.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you for this opportunity to present my ongoing research project on conceptualizing and modeling rhetorical injustice. And in my today's presentation, I will narrow my focus, and mostly I will be focusing on the model, on one empirical model of rhetorical injustice that I have identified and tested in the context of indigenous resource development consultations. And definitely I will tell you about some theoretical aspects of the rhetorical injustice, some theoretical concepts that I'm using to show this, to justify this particular model of rhetorical injustice in the context of indigenous consultations. So I would like to start with the reference to French sociologist and philosopher Michel Foucault, because he's one of the first person who makes connection between discourse, between power and regulatory regime. And he emphasizes the limited nature of discourses and at the same time productive nature of power. And Foucault particularly defines discourses as something that needs to be ordered, to submit it to certain laws. It is just as if prohibitions, barriers, thresholds, and limits had been set up in order to master, at least partly, the great proliferation of discourse, in order to remove from its richness the most dangerous part and to organize its disorder according to figures which dodge what is most uncontrollable about it. And that organizing force is power. And Foucault says, when power is seized, discourse comes into life. And his power is productive. It means it produces discourse participants. It produces knowledge itself as a regime of truth. And when Foucault speaking about truth, he is not saying about the regime of truth. He is not saying about a collection of particular facts or a kind of mathematical truths or a kind of objective facts that needs to be discovered or tested. No, his truth regime is a kind of regulatory regime, is a set of contextually specific, and I would say place and time specific procedures, institutions, practices, and authorities that define what statements will be produced, validated, distributed, and sanctioned as true or convincing, I would extend. So his truth regime is actually suggests regulatory regime as a composition of procedures, institutions, practices, and authorities. And those are main components of his truth regime that actually attract my attention. And I focus on regulatory regime. And each regulatory regime, it actually carries its own institutional discourse as produced when institutional power is seized, and with the expansion of the Foucauldian liberal regulatory state, we can observe an abundance of institutional discourses. And those discourses happen at every point of our experiencing of this state, when we need to communicate with state or institutional representatives. So, and this is all cases that concerns our health, our education. We actually enter institutional discourses when we have parents-teacher conferences, when we have judicial trials, when we enter police officers, and so on and so on. And institutional representatives who led those discourses, they actually promote liberal regulatory values of well-being, and individual responsibility. And in such a way, they actually produce a complacent person. So I would like to say that those discourses led by institutional representatives as institutional experts, and those experts, they possess institutional expertise as the most reliable expertise in connecting facts and laws and regulations. And institutional experts, they apply institutional practices as a sites of their power when they do surveys, when they do classifications, monitoring, acknowledging, produce regulations. And particularly Foucault says it's actually hard to identify a single source of institutional power. Who is a power holder? Look at a person who produces a table, look at a person who does a survey for the interest of serving the regulatory state. And this particular person, public servant, public administrator, who produces this particular decision, this particular table that classifies information about all aspects of our life, that means this particular person possesses power. He is actually a representative of the state. And that institutional representative applies institutional rules and procedures, and he or she, they produce institutional evidentiary records. So that actually validate particular evidence sources and put that sources on the records and those records are reflected into institutional registers. Registers, those are briefing notes, policy programs, reports, often publicly available and published. So, talking about institutional expert as a power holder, I would like to also refer to public administration scholar Roy Halderberg. Roy Halderberg defines expert as practitioners of a hermeneutics of fabricated experience in the sense that it's constructed through controlled experiments, statistical analysis, and other forms of data collection preferred by the liberal regulatory state to produce scientific knowledge. And probably mostly all people heard about such concept as positivist public policy analysis or evidence-based decision-making. And expert knowledge is in hierarchical relations, although this is kind of fabricated knowledge based on fabricated experience. Expert knowledge is in hierarchical relations with all other types of knowledge in a liberal regulatory state, including correlational and traditional knowledge. And this is especially evident in the context of indigenous resource development consultations. In Canada, the Canadian administrative state is constitutionally obliged to consult indigenous communities about the project-related adverse effects on their traditional and cultural uses. And in those consultations, indigenous communities, they possess first-hand experience of dealing with those adverse effects. And on the other side, there is a designated state agency, a regulatory agency, that represents states and that actually embodies institutional expertise. Precisely, the regulatory state defines regulatory agency as agency possessing institutional expertise in accommodating indigenous concerns about project-related effects and reconciling those concerns with the project-related adverse effects to attain a particular decision. So we can see that on the one side, institutional expertise embodied by a regulatory agency, on the other side, indigenous experts and knowers. And Canadian state is constitutionally obliged to accommodate indigenous concerns while making decisions about pursuing a particular resource development project. But to have their concerns accommodated in the agency decisions and to have their testimonies and arguments being placed on the institutional registers, indigenous knowers need to convince the regulatory agency of the credibility of their testimonies and arguments about the project-related disruptive effects on traditional and cultural uses. So, and to understand how actually indigenous concerns accommodated, I looked into this particular case of transmountain consultations. I selected this case because this very silent case, 2 rounds of indigenous hearings happened, and the Federal Court of Appeal recognized those consultations as lacking a meaningful or two-sided dialogue with indigenous communities. And a lot of indigenous concerns have been unresolved in those consultations. They actually labeled as unconvincing and not resolved. So I started to look, and my question is, why can't indigenous knowers possessing first-hand experience of coping with the project-related adverse effects on traditional and cultural uses, why can't indigenous knowers convince the institutional experts of the credibility of their concerns? And I looked into precisely this context of that consultations and precisely context of this institutional discourse. And you can see that the same regulatory agency, particularly National Energy Board, and right now this is Canada Energy Regulator, the same agency imposes mandatory requirements for producing and exchanging argument and testimonies about project development. This is regulatory stage consultations. The same agency adjudicates testimonies and arguments against those requirements. This is hearing stage of consultations. And the same agency accommodates, just validated, just approved testimonies and arguments in institutional registers, its reports, to recommend a affirmative decision. In the Trans Mountain case, decision has been done by the Governing Council, by the National Energy Board, produced its recommendation. But the inferences are performative, that means actionable, mandatory. So, and I looked precisely into the institutional register. This is National Energy Board Reconsideration Report, published in 2019 after conducting the second round of indigenous hearings, to look precisely which appeals types the agency uses to respond to outstanding indigenous concerns, and identified 7 types of appeals. Weighted evidence appeal, when agency says, cites particular authoritative sources to reject, to rebut indigenous concerns. Evidence consistency appeal, when agency cites a lack of consistency with prior rules, decisions, and regulations to reject concerns. Evidence sufficiency appeal, when agency says that no additional data, no additional submissions are required. Scientific consensus appeal, a lack of scientific consensus in indigenous testimonies as a ground to reject those concerns. Collaboration appeal, when agency refers to coordinated efforts with other agencies to resolve concerns, and in such a case justify the production of rebuttals at this particular moment. And passing the buck appeal, and which agency says that no positional responsibility, no agency is assigned to handle this particular project-related adverse effect. That's why there is a ground to reject concern. And promise commitment appeal, then agency says, don't worry, please downplay your concerns. We will do everything. We will do a mitigation program and financial measures and other remediations to alleviate those concerns in the future. So I just give you a couple examples of two appeals because I have produced annotation guidelines. I have defined each appeal and I have identified its discourse markers. So an evidence consistency appeal cites regulations, normative standards, or previously accepted reports, decisions to show that project evidence aligns with previously accepted facts, mitigation programs, or regulatory requirements. This emphasizes that institutional compliance and integrity function as a proxy for rhetorical persuasiveness. And here you can see discourse markers. And I will give you the second example how I define an evidence sufficiency appeal. An evidence sufficiency appeal asserts that existing evidence regulations capacity are sufficient to downplay any concerns with the project development and its adverse effects on traditional and cultural uses. So nothing more needs to be done or submitted. The emphasis is on the weight of the evidence that has already been verified and placed on the institutional records and closing venues for submitting new evidence or reconsidering the previously accepted one. And here discourse markers, the data presented are sufficient, the proponent's assessments adequately addresses mitigation, no further analysis is needed at this time. The evidence on the record is sufficient. So I used those discourse markers and I classified 576 institutional rebuttals, and I have also identified 560 non-institutional rebuttals. I am not focusing on non-institutional rebuttals in my today's presentation because I published relevant guidelines in my paper in argumentation and advocacy in the case of if nobody has interest. So I just would like to say that non-institutional rebuttals, that means appeals to evidentiary uncertainty, complexity, probability calculations, and hasty generalizations. Totally annotating institutional and non-institutional rebuttals, I produce a data set of 1136 responses, and I selected 3 pre-trained BERT models and benchmark backward. I used to classify those institutional and non-institutional rebuttals automatically, and you can see how those models performed in the accuracy, very high accuracy level, and this we can see that BERT pre-trained model outperformed backward significantly. And definitely that may be a risk of overfitting because small set of data, but this is my ongoing project and I'm going to expand my data set. But at this particular stage, these models are workable and they can actually be used on any fresh data of any public policy consultations where we do have an institutional register where we can look for institutional rebuttals. So what I found that National Energy Board produced rebuttals towards indigenous concerns over 73 trans-mountain related adverse effects on traditional and cultural uses. And that means 77% of all rebuttals were, but among those, institutional, so over 53 topics were covered with the institutional rebuttals. So 77% of all rebuttals, institutional rebuttals, were 77% of all rebuttals produced by agency in this particular case of consultations. My question is this rebuttal response pattern part of the regulatory regime in indigenous consultations? And I started to look into regulatory regime. I looked precisely into the National Energy Board rules of practice and procedure and the National Energy Board hearing orders. Here I applied the Eleanor Ostrom Institutional Development Framework I classified all the rules of indigenous consultations as produced by the National Energy Board into 4 types of rules: boundary rules, scope rules, information rules, and aggregation rules. And then I calculated rules to agency index. This is a replicable methodological tool to quantify rule preclusivity. So whether rule produce high or low compliance costs for participants. And I have used those indicators like thresholds, burden costs, rigidity, discretion, administrative discretion, sequencing, sanctions, accessibility. I assign weights to those indicators and ratings. I'm so sorry for rushing through all this technology because I do not have time. I'm just saying you about this. Here's the scoring formula, which I have applied. And I'm just reporting you my results. So this is outcomes. This is weighted index for each rule group. We can see that rule stringency is very high. Boundary rules 95, scope rules 95, information rules 95, and aggregation rules 100. And that means that those rules will actually produce high compliance cost. And here I would like to recall Eleanor Ostrom main claim that when we need to look into the regulatory effects of a particular rule type, we need to focus how rules interact between themselves. We actually should consider rule configuration clusters. And I identified a lot of those clusters produced by the interaction effect, all 4 rule types. And here I'm giving an example of 3 of them. When information requests, they have been used by agency as the most reliable evidence exchange procedure, plus non-stated, implicit, completely discretionary evidentiary standards. Then agency applied its discretion to adjudicate evidence sufficiency or evidence relevance, and plus limited hearing scopes. Then indigenous communities could submit their evidence on just pre-approved list of issues. The second cluster, sequential hearings, when the company submits its assessments first, and agency approves, verifies company's assessments, and then test indigenous submissions against companies' already verified and approved assessments. And actually treating companies' models and assessments as baseline findings and distributing burdens of proof contingently upon of that. There were numerous cases when indigenous communities challenged companies' findings, but the agency stated that it's not convinced and imposed burdens of proofs on indigenous communities, saying that those who disagree must take efforts to prove the irrelevance or insufficiency or incorrectness of findings of the company. So, and I also found those rule configurations actually produced those equilibrium features. They actually constrain indigenous participation significantly. They actually endorsed extraction of indigenous evidence, so just evidence that satisfy institutional requirements of evidence sufficiency and relevance. Just that evidence had been put onto records that actually endorse proponent favorite narrative and limited disagreement space. That means it was very challenging, it was very costly for indigenous communities to disagree with companies' findings. And this, as a result, that was procedural ease to rebut outstanding concerns, to rebut indigenous testimonies. So, and I found this actually rules rebuttals loop. Then high stringency rules produce preclusive constraints, and institutional rebuttals or responses explode those constraints to dismiss uncongenial evidence as non-compliant, prioritizing institutional integrity over the epistemic standing of testimonies and arguments. And institutional rebuttal, this is one of the concepts of my favorite, my lovely concept. So institutional rebuttal actually show the clash between epistemic and deontic authority, as Kozovi and Walton in their paper published in Pragmatic and Society. They differentiated between epistemic authority and argumentative authority. And in indigenous consultations, and building on this paper, I can say that in indigenous consultations, epistemic power belongs to indigenous communities by virtue of their first-hand experience. But in administrative, Walton and Kozlovi call that deontic power, but I call administrative. It's very close to what I am seeing as institutional power. This to institutional experts, to regulatory agencies, that by virtue of their administrative mandates and position from the state possess this power. And in a case of conflict between epistemic and administrative power, institutional experts invoke this mandate to give institutional epistemic weight to particular arguments and testimonies, rendering them rhetorically convincing and worth accommodation in institutional registers. So I usually give you a very short example, ecological risk assessment, example of this clash between epistemic and institutional power. So this is approach as pursued by indigenous knowers. This is approach that is based in traditional ecological knowledge, that ecological risk assessment should be conducted accounting for historical context, not only for discrete and urgent observations. And those assessments should account for species-specific sensitivities, their different exposure routes, foraging patterns, life histories, habit use, population status, so on. And in the Trans-Mountain consultation, there was the issue of the Trans-Mountain related ecological risk assessments. And Trans-Mountain approach was to use a small set of surrogate species or indicator species to model spill impacts. Indigenous experts, interveners, objected to this indicator approach, arguing that this method might not actually capture the full range of vulnerabilities across all CRA listed species. That means species listed under Schedule 1 of the Canadian Act on Endangered Species, and warned that it could actually underestimate impacts on species at risk. And that was an approach coming from traditional ecological knowledge. They supported their arguments with traditional ecological knowledge, but the agency, National Energy Board, accepted company's approach as compliant with agency's ruling number 24, because in this ruling, agency validated company's approach, lent company's findings institutional credibility, and rebutted indigenous arguments and testimonies as lacking regulatory compliance with that ruling, and means lacking institutional credibility. And this was the case of regulatory rhetorical equilibrium. And I schematize this case in this diagram. So you can see regulatory stage of consultations. Aggregation rule has been issued, agency ruling number 24, that validates indicator species approach. Then hearing stage, the agency says that company's findings are totally in line with that ruling. totally consistent. And then when indigenous communities challenged companies' indicators, species approach, agency rebutted those concerns, saying that companies' approach is adequate. And indigenous approach lacks consistency with a standard practice for conducting an ecological risk assessments, actually producing institutional rebuttals. Sorry, that should be not authority, institutional rebuttal. So, and you see this regulatory rhetorical equilibrium is in effect, where agency produces mandatory evidentiary formats, then agency endorses aligned submissions as credible, then agency evaluates indigenous concerns against validated models and methodologies, and then non-conforming evidence is labeled as unconvincing and rebutted on authority grounds, and agency produces recommendations that condition the project development based on validated evidence, while indigenous concerns are always acknowledged. This is a rhetorical strategy. Agency always acknowledges indigenous concerns, but marginalizes those testimonies in the impact. So what I would like to say that identified 7 types of rebuttals. And those rebuttals individually may appear completely benign or argumentatively valid. But collectively, within an institutional discourse built around the Trans Mountain Project, they reveal a persistent pattern of institutional injustice, as indigenous arguments and testimonies were rejected as non-compliant with the agency regulatory regime. And I conceptualize this case as a case of rhetorical injustice. And I would like to say that rhetorical injustice is a type of institutional injustice, as defined by Anderson in her paper, published in Social Epistemology, to my best memory, if I'm not mistaken. So, and rhetorical injustice, as I modeled in this particular case of regulatory rhetorical equilibrium, it happens at the level of structure, not transactions like epistemic or argumentative injustice. That institution in rhetorical injustice, harm is institutional credibility challenge, not deficit, not denial. So it's actually procedurally generated. High stringency rules make it extremely hard to satisfy the regulatory regime. High stringency rules produce high compliance costs, and they actually procedurally seize institutional capacity to build a convincing case for first-hand experiences. And mechanism is structurally generated compliance cost, not transactionally generated biases and stereotypes. And the hardest thing with compliance cost is a concept from public administration. And when they impose compliance cost, they actually don't target particular individuals or particular groups. Compliance costs are addressed to all participants of a particular institutional discourse. But the injustice that accompanies compliance cost is that they always fall hardest on the most epistemically and culturally diverse people, on the most marginalized people. And this implicit mechanism make actually very hard to challenge those rules and arrangements that forming regulatory regime actually procedurally seize rhetorical freedom and rhetorical agency of a particular participant of an institutional discourse. And rhetoric is changed from my perspective. In the case of rhetorical injustice, rhetoric becomes structural, not transactional. It becomes a part of a regulatory regime, structure set up by institutional expert. It's not a feature of an argument or testimony. It's not a feature of a communicative interactivity. It's actually become embedded into the regulatory regime itself. It becomes a set of procedural practices. It becomes a part of a truth regime as described by Foucault, a set of practices deployed to manage disagreement, to preserve stability and integrity, consistency and compliance, often at the expense of people whose ways of knowing and living fall outside liberal epistemic practices of knowledge production and exchange. I define institutional discourses as liberal epistemic practices of knowledge production and exchange, as those practices promote liberal regulatory values of autonomy, individualism, and responsibility. So in this case, it's actually in rhetorical injustice, rhetoric actually it's rhetorical persuasiveness. An argument, a testimony is rhetorically persuasive for an institutional expert just in one case, if there is clear regulatory compliance. So, and institutional power-wise change. And because institutional power actually usurps epistemic and argumentative power within this particular institutional discourse and put it to the service of an institutional expertise, to which an institutional representative is mandated by the virtue of this position. And I would like just to restate that institutional experts will invoke their position, their mandate, given by the state, to give an institutional weight to preferred evidence sources and to rebut unfavorable ones as unconvincing, or in other terms, lacking compliance and consistency. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm glad to stop sharing.